On a cold morning in 1872, a ship was found drifting alone in the Atlantic. Her sails were still up. Her cargo was still there. Food and supplies had not run out. Nothing about her looked like a total wreck. And yet, not a single person remained on board. The captain was gone. His wife was gone. His child was gone. Every crew member had vanished. No signs of a violent attack. No bodies. No clear explanation. Just one ship, floating in silence, as if the people aboard had been erased from the world. They called it one of the greatest maritime mysteries in history. This is the story of the ghost ship, Mary. The most terrifying thing about the ocean has never been the storm. It is the silence. In the winter of 1872, a merchant ship sailed across the Atlantic, as it always had. It was not especially large, not especially luxurious. In fact, from the outside, it looked no different from the thousands of other vessels struggling for survival on the open sea. And yet this ordinary ship would go on to become one of the most haunting names in maritime history. The ghost ship, Mary. The people who first spotted her did not immediately realize that they were about to witness one of the most famous mysteries ever recorded at sea. That day, another ship sailing nearby noticed her drifting on the horizon. From a distance, the Mary still seemed to be in working condition. Her sails had not fully collapsed. Her hull showed no obvious signs of catastrophic damage. By all appearances, this was still a ship capable of staying afloat. And yet something was wrong. No one could be seen on deck. No sailors. No movement. No response. At sea, in those days, one vessel encountering another was never a trivial matter. Sailors watched each other carefully. The flags, the heading, the condition of the ship. Because such details were not just courtesy. They were survival. A ship that did not answer was already troubling. But a ship that still looked seaworthy, and yet showed no sign of human life at all. That was something far worse. So the other vessel moved closer. As the distance narrowed, the strangeness only deepened. The Mary was drifting, yes, but not like a ship that had been completely abandoned to chaos. She still seemed to carry some trace of order. The ropes were somewhat messy, but not in the way they would be after a violent wreck. The hull sat normally in the water. There was no clear sign that she was about to sink. And somehow, that appearance of normality made everything even more unnatural. When the boarding party finally stepped onto the ship, their first impression was almost identical. Someone had been living here. And not long ago. There were signs of daily life inside the cabins. Utensils were still there. Some personal belongings remained untouched. Most of the cargo was intact. The ship's supplies had not been exhausted. It did not look like a pirate attack, because the valuables and provisions had not been systematically taken. It did not look like a mutiny, because there were no obvious signs of struggle. And it did not look like a total maritime disaster, because the ship itself was still there, floating, whole, and eerily intact. But the captain was gone. His family was gone. And every crew member had vanished. Even the lifeboat was missing. A ship left untouched. A crew that had disappeared. An ocean that offered no answers. From that moment on, the Mary was no longer just a ship. It became a question. A question that, even after more than a century, has never been fully answered. And the deeper investigators looked, the stranger it became. Because this was not a case where nothing had happened. It was a case where something had happened, and then stopped halfway. Some navigation instruments were missing. The logbook ended abruptly on a certain day. A few doors and hatches were left open. There was a small amount of water on deck. Parts of the interior had been dampened by seawater. None of these clues pointed cleanly to a single answer. But together they created a chilling impression. Whoever had left this ship had done so in extreme haste and under extreme tension. But why? If the ship had truly been in enough danger to justify abandoning it, why had it not sunk? If they had left voluntarily, why choose the far more fragile lifeboat over the far safer main vessel? And if they had not left voluntarily, then how had they vanished at all? That is what makes the mystery of the Mary so deeply unsettling. It is not a wreck buried beneath the sea, forever out of human reach. It is a crime scene returned to us by the waves, unfinished. A ship can speak. Its sails, its cabins, its cargo, its logbook, its damage, even the things missing from it, all tell a story. But what the Mary told the world was not an answer. It was a series of deeper and darker questions. In the years that followed, people began to create explanations of their own. Some said the ship had been cursed. Others claimed the crew had seen something they were never meant to see. And some simply believed that there are forces at sea, beyond human understanding. Forces that, at certain moments, can erase an entire crew from the world, without leaving a trace. These stories sound like fiction. But what made the Mary unforgettable was never fiction. It was the fact that this really happened. Because the most terrifying mysteries are never the ones invented out of thin air. They are the ones you know truly occurred, and yet can never fully explain. And this is only the beginning. Because if we want to understand why the Mary became a ghost ship, we have to go back to the time before she was found. Back to the people who were still alive. Back to the voyage that, at first glance, looked completely ordinary. Perhaps the real answer does not lie in the moment she was discovered. Perhaps it was already buried the moment she left the harbor. Almost every strange event begins in the most ordinary way. Before the Mary ever became a legend, before people called her a ghost ship, before her name was spoken in whispers and documentaries, she was simply preparing for another commercial voyage. Nothing about her departure seemed unusual. She was not a warship, not an expedition vessel, not a ship on some classified mission. She was a merchant ship, carrying cargo from one port to another. In that era, ships like hers left harbor every day. So often, in fact, that no one would have imagined. One of them was sailing toward immortality. The captain was not reckless. He was not a desperate man chasing fortune through impossible risks. By all accounts, he was experienced, capable, and familiar with the sea. And perhaps the strongest sign that this voyage appeared safe was the fact that he brought his family with him. His wife was on board. His young child was on board. That detail matters. A man may gamble with his own life. Many sailors do. But very few fathers knowingly bring their family into what they believe will be certain danger. The presence of his wife and child tells us something essential. To him, at the beginning, this voyage did not look like a death sentence. The crew, too, appeared ordinary enough. They were not a chaotic collection of drifters. Most had real experience at sea. The ship's cargo, industrial alcohol, was valuable and dangerous, yes. But it was not unheard of. It was the sort of freight that could be transported, managed, and delivered under normal conditions. The route was not extraordinary. The weather at the beginning was not immediately catastrophic. And the ship herself, despite not being brand new, was still considered capable of making the journey. In other words, if you had stood on the harbor that day and watched the Mary leave, you would have seen nothing worth remembering. The sails would have risen. The ropes would have been loosened. The hull would have drifted out into open water. People on shore might have waved. People on deck might have waved back. Everything would have looked exactly the way it was supposed to. And that is what makes stories like this so disturbing. Because the most frightening disasters are not always the ones that announce themselves in advance. Sometimes the real horror lies in this. Nothing looks wrong, and yet something is already on its way. When we look backward now, we cannot help but search that departure scene for signs. A hesitation in the captain's face. A strange expression from one of the sailors. A sense, however faint, that something was already wrong. But history rarely gives us that kind of warning. Most tragedies do not begin with thunder. They begin with normality. And hidden inside that normality may have been the first seeds of what was to come. The Mary had experienced delays and repairs before sailing. That alone is not suspicious, many ships did. But a repaired ship is never the same as an untouched ship. A repaired structure carries memory inside it. Stress, wear, and compromise. Then there was the cargo. Industrial alcohol may not sound dramatic to modern ears. But aboard a wooden ship at sea, it was not a harmless burden. It could leak. It could evaporate. It could create danger not only through fire, but through the fear of fire. And fear, at sea, can be as lethal as flame itself. Imagine the conditions. You are weeks from land. You are confined inside wood, rope, canvas, and cargo. You hear the ship groan in the dark. You smell something unfamiliar below deck. You know that beneath your feet lie barrels of volatile liquid. You do not have modern sensors. No emergency response team. No Coast Guard helicopter. No instant communication. Only judgment. And judgment, under pressure, is not the same thing as certainty. At the harbor, none of this would have been visible. The people saying goodbye would not have known that ordinary cargo might one day become the center of a mystery. The sailors themselves likely did not know it either. To them, this was work. To the captain's family, perhaps it was another passage. To the dock workers, another departure. To the sea, just another ship. And yet that is often how legends begin. Not with a sign, but with the complete absence of one. The Mary's departure did not feel cursed. It did not feel cinematic. It did not feel like the opening scene of one of the greatest maritime mysteries in history. It felt safe enough. And perhaps that is the cruelest part. Because once we know what happened later, every calm image becomes painful. Every ordinary gesture becomes a farewell. The captain standing on deck one last time, looking back at the harbor. His wife perhaps holding the child. The crew going about familiar tasks. The sound of gulls fading. The shoreline shrinking. No one knew that the world would remember this ship not for its arrival, but for its emptiness. And perhaps that is the true betrayal at the heart of the Mary's story. Not that she vanished into danger, but that danger never introduced itself. It came disguised as routine, as work, as one more journey across the sea. And by the time anyone realized otherwise, it was already too late. To understand what happened next, we have to leave the harbor behind and step onto the deck of the ship that was eventually found. Still floating, still intact, and yet somehow more terrifying than a wreck. Because the strangest part of the Mary's story is not that she was lost. It is that she survived. If a ship sinks and her crew disappears, the sea has done what it has always done. But the Mary was different. What made her terrifying was not destruction. It was survival. When the boarding party finally stepped onto her deck, they did not find a ruin. They did not find a burnt shell, a blood-soaked mutiny scene, or the smashed remains of a violent storm. What they found was something far worse. A half-normal world. The kind of place that makes your skin crawl. Because it feels as though people were here only moments ago. The deck was weathered and somewhat disordered, but not ravaged. The sails were damaged in part, but not annihilated. The ropes were not perfectly arranged, yet they were not the shredded remains of total chaos either. The hull was still floating in serviceable condition. There was water inside the ship, yes, but not enough to explain a complete and immediate abandonment. Food remained. Water remained. Cargo remained. Personal belongings remained. The ship was not comfortable, but she was not dead. And yet every human being aboard her was gone. The captain was gone. His wife was gone. His child was gone. Every sailor was gone. 10 people in total. Erased from the ship as if by design. That is what makes the Mary more unnerving than a sunken wreck. A wreck at least tells you what happened. It says, the sea won. But the Mary told a different story. She said, something happened here. Something serious enough to remove every person aboard. And still I remained. Even more unsettling was the pattern of what was missing and what was left behind. Some key navigational instruments were gone. That suggested preparation. Deliberate departure. Not a random wave sweeping the deck clean. Not sudden collective collapse. Whoever left had taken certain items necessary for survival. The lifeboat, too, was missing. That matters enormously. Because once the lifeboat is gone, the mystery shifts. This is no longer a story about people being swallowed instantly by disaster. It becomes a story about people choosing to leave. And that is where the nightmare truly begins. Sailors are not taught to abandon a seaworthy ship lightly. At sea, the main vessel is shelter, height, supplies, structure, visibility, life itself. A lifeboat is not a better option. It is a final option. So why would an experienced captain take his family and crew off a ship that still seemed capable of floating? The scene on board suggested haste, but not madness. Urgency, but not complete collapse. Some items had been left behind that might have been useful later. That implied the departure was not leisurely. If they had planned to leave permanently, they likely would have taken more. But if they had left too quickly, then they must have believed the danger was immediate. And here we reach the central contradiction of the Mary. If the danger was immediate, why did the ship not sink? If the danger was not immediate, why leave so quickly? This contradiction is what transformed a maritime puzzle into a legend. Some researchers have argued that the answer lies not in actual catastrophe, but in the expectation of catastrophe. That distinction changes everything. It may be that the ship was not in the final stages of destruction, but that those aboard believed she was. The cargo was industrial alcohol. Under certain conditions, vapors could accumulate. Leakage from barrels was possible. A sudden pressure event, a strange sound, a burst of vapor, or an unexplained jolt inside the hull could easily convince a captain that a fatal explosion was moments away. Notice what is required here. Not a massive inferno. Not visible flames tearing through the deck. Only one thing. A credible belief that the next moment could be fatal. In such a situation, the rational choice might have seemed obvious. Lower the lifeboat. Take the family. Take the crew. Take essential instruments. Get a short distance away from the main vessel. Wait. Observe. Return once the danger passes. That theory has become one of the strongest explanations, because it fits so much of what was found. It explains why everyone left together. It explains why the lifeboat was missing. It explains why some instruments were taken. And it explains why the ship herself remained afloat. Because perhaps they never meant to abandon her forever. Perhaps they only meant to leave for a little while. And at sea, a little while can become eternity. All it would take is a change in wind, a rise in waves, a frayed rope, a single failed connection between lifeboat and ship. Once separated, a small boat on the open ocean becomes almost invisible, almost powerless. Meanwhile, the larger vessel, even partially impaired, may continue to drift on. That is the cruel geometry of the sea. The wrong thing survives. The Mary stayed alive long enough to be discovered. The people did not. It is as though the ocean made a grotesque choice. It spared the evidence and erased the witnesses. And so the ship became a question without a voice. Every plank, every sail, every wet surface, every missing instrument seemed to say that something had happened. But none of it could tell investigators exactly what. That uncertainty opened two paths. One path belonged to reason. The other belonged to myth. Before we step into the dark world of legends, we have to stay with reason a little longer. Because only after we examine everything that can be explained, do we begin to understand why the unexplained portion feels so large. The Mary did not become a ghost ship merely because people vanished. She became one because the facts almost make sense. Almost. A true mystery is rarely built on a complete absence of clues. More often, it is built on clues that refuse to form a complete picture. That was the case with the Mary. The ship was not empty of evidence. In fact, she contained just enough evidence to suggest a coherent explanation, and just enough contradiction to keep that explanation forever incomplete. The logbook was one of the first troubling details. It did not continue all the way to the point of discovery. It stopped earlier. That means there was a final stretch of time aboard the Mary, for which we have no direct narrative at all. A blank interval. And in investigations, blank intervals are dangerous. That is where possibility multiplies. That is where truth weakens, and imagination begins to feed. Then there was the water found in the vessel. Not enough to sink her immediately, but enough to raise concern. Some argued that the captain may have believed the ship was taking on more water than she could handle. Others dismissed that idea, noting that an experienced mariner would not abandon ship over a manageable amount of water alone. And that is likely correct. Which suggests the water, if relevant at all, was not the sole cause. It was one stress among several. Then we return to the missing equipment. The absence of certain navigational tools matters enormously. If people had simply been washed overboard, the tools would still be there. If pirates had stormed the ship, why take people and a handful of instruments but leave the cargo? If mutiny had broken out, where were the signs of violence? No, these missing instruments strongly imply that someone intended to survive at sea after leaving the vessel. That means order, decision, sequence. And once we accept that, the scenario becomes narrower. The people aboard the Mary likely did not vanish by supernatural means. They likely did not disappear all at once. They likely made a choice. A hurried one. A fearful one. But a choice nonetheless. So what kind of danger forces capable sailors to leave a still floating ship in a hurry, while still retaining enough composure to take navigational devices? The cargo keeps pulling us back. Industrial alcohol is not merely valuable. It is volatile. Some later examinations suggested that a number of barrels may not have been in perfect condition. Leakage was possible. And leakage at sea, inside a wooden vessel, creates a terrible kind of uncertainty. You may not see fire. You may not see smoke. But if vapor fills enclosed spaces, if pressure shifts, if the hull produces strange sounds, if the smell becomes sharp and unnatural, Then every person on board begins to imagine the same thing. Explosion. This is where modern hindsight misleads us. We know the ship did not explode. We know she remained afloat. So from our safe distance, it is tempting to say they overreacted. But the people on board did not have hindsight. They only had the moment. And the moment may have looked very different. A captain standing in the dark on a rolling deck, with his family beside him and volatile cargo below, does not make decisions with the benefit of future evidence. He makes them with fear, smell, sound, pressure, and instinct. And instinct at sea can be the difference between life and death, or the reason death arrives. Some evidence has also led researchers to suspect that the lifeboat may not have been launched as a permanent escape. Instead, it may have been attached to the ship by rope, dragging at a safe distance while those aboard waited to see whether the danger passed. This is a powerful theory, because it resolves a major problem. Why abandon a ship that had not yet sunk? Perhaps they never intended to truly abandon it. Perhaps they only meant to step away from it, to stay clear in case of explosion, to return if nothing happened, to buy time. It sounds sensible. Too sensible, perhaps, because sensible plans fail on the ocean every day. A gust of wind could shift the ship's angle. A sudden swell could strain the line. A worn rope could snap under tension. And once that happened, the situation would reverse in a heartbeat. The large ship would drift on. The lifeboat would be left behind. What had begun as a temporary measure would become permanent exile. There is something especially tragic about this possibility. Not because it is supernatural, but because it is human. It means no monster was required. No curse. No shadow moving through the mist. Only a sequence of understandable decisions, made under understandable fear, inside an environment that punishes small errors with absolute finality. Yet even this explanation, strong as it is, does not answer everything. Why did the log stop when it did? Why are some details still resistant to this theory? Why has the Mary continued to inspire ghost stories for generations? The answer may be simple. Because reason explains most of the story, but not all of it. And wherever reason stops short, the human mind invites darkness in. That darkness gave birth to the legend of the Mary. But before we enter the world of curses and haunted ships, we need to face one uncomfortable truth. The rational explanation may already be terrifying enough. Because if the Mary was lost not to the impossible, but to a moment of mistaken judgment under pressure, then the ship is no longer just a mystery. She becomes a warning. The most widely accepted explanation for the Mary is not supernatural. In fact, it is painfully practical. The crew may have believed the ship was in immediate danger. From explosion, structural failure, flooding, or a combination of threats. And they chose to temporarily evacuate. Once they did, they were separated from the ship and lost at sea. From an investigative point of view, this explanation works remarkably well. The cargo was hazardous. The missing lifeboat suggests departure. The missing instruments suggest intention. The ship's remaining condition suggests she was not destroyed after they left. The absence of clear signs of piracy or mutiny makes those theories weaker. And yet even this explanation leaves many people unsatisfied. Not because it lacks logic, but because it lacks closure. A fully satisfying explanation usually does two things. It tells us what happened, and it tells us why people behaved the way they did. The Mary's most reasonable theory covers the first part better than the second. Because we still have to ask, would an experienced captain really make that decision? Possibly, yes. But not lightly. A seasoned mariner understands that a main vessel, even a damaged one, is often safer than a small open lifeboat. To move his wife, his child, and his crew off the ship, he must have believed the danger was immediate enough to outweigh all other risks. That means something on board must have seemed very, very wrong. Maybe fumes had built up below deck. Maybe a sound like a pressure blast was heard. Maybe one of the barrels had ruptured violently. Maybe the crew believed the ship was moments from ignition. But once we move into that maybe, we enter the very zone that keeps the Mary unresolved. Because the theory is strong in structure, but weak in specifics. And unresolved specifics are where unease survives. There are other questions too. If the evacuation was temporary, why did they not return? The obvious answer is they could not. The rope may have broken. The wind may have changed. The lifeboat may have drifted too far too fast. That is certainly plausible. But we do not know the exact moment it happened. We do not know how far they got. We do not know whether they saw the Mary sailing away from them in the distance. We do not know whether they tried to row after her until exhaustion ended the effort. And because we do not know, the case remains emotionally unfinished. This is why so many people resist the rational answer. Not because it is weak, but because it feels almost too ordinary for such an extraordinary result. An entire crew vanishes. A ship drifts alone on the ocean. A family disappears without a trace. And the explanation may simply be a terrible decision made in a terrible moment. That feels cruelly small. People often want mysteries to have mysteries-sized causes. They want something dramatic enough to justify the legend. Pirates. Murder. Conspiracy. A secret struggle. Something dark and cinematic. But reality is often more brutal than cinema. Reality does not always provide grandeur. Sometimes it gives only one mistake. One misunderstanding. One shift in weather. And a silence that lasts for centuries. Other theories have of course been proposed. Piracy is one of the most popular, because it is easy to imagine and easy to dramatize. But the evidence works against it. Valuable cargo remained. The ship was not stripped. There was no clear sign of violent seizure. Real pirates do not usually remove every person from a vessel, while leaving so much behind. Mutiny has also been suggested. Perhaps the crew turned on the captain. Perhaps violence broke out. Perhaps something inside the ship's social order collapsed. But again, the evidence is thin. There were no obvious signs of bloodshed. No strong motive has ever emerged that clearly supports such an event. And if mutiny did occur, why did the mutineers then vanish as well? There is also the fantasy of fraud or insurance conspiracy. A planned disappearance. A staged abandonment. A hidden arrangement. These ideas are seductive because they make the mystery feel intelligent, as though a hidden hand orchestrated everything. But they are difficult to support, and even harder to execute on the open sea without leaving stronger traces. One by one, the alternatives weaken, and the more they weaken, the more the basic explanation returns. Something frightened the people aboard the Mary badly enough that leaving the ship felt safer than staying. Then the sea made sure. They could never correct that decision. If that is true, then what bothers us most is not mystery in the supernatural sense. It is the realization that some of history's most haunting legends may have been born from moments that were, in human terms, tragically understandable. There is no demon in that version. No hidden curse. Only a captain trying to protect lives. A crew trying to survive. A plan that may have made sense for a minute. And an ocean that gave them no second chance. Perhaps that is why the reasonable explanation feels incomplete. Because it denies us the comfort of a larger villain. It forces us to face something colder, The people aboard the Mary may not have been defeated by evil. They may have been defeated by fear, uncertainty, and the unbearable pressure of making the wrong decision. For all the right reasons. That is not a satisfying legend, but it may be the most honest one. And yet honesty alone has never been enough to stop a mystery from growing darker in the public imagination. Because when a story remains open long enough, facts begin to erode, and legend begins to replace them. An unsolved mystery does not remain stable. At first, it exists as an event, then as a report, then as a rumor, then, if it lasts long enough, as folklore. The Mary followed that path almost perfectly. When she was first discovered, she was a maritime anomaly. A ship adrift, a crew missing, a case demanding explanation. But over time, that case became a story. And once a story enters the public imagination, people begin adding what reality failed to provide. They add images, they add sounds, they add scenes. And so the Mary slowly transformed from an abandoned ship into a haunted one. This transformation did not happen because new evidence appeared. It happened because empty spaces in a mystery invite invention. People began repeating details that were never firmly established. Some claimed that when the boarding party entered the ship, they found meals still on the table. Others said the captain's tea had been left untouched, as if he had just stood up and would return any second. Some stories insisted that the crew's belongings were laid out in such a way that it felt impossible for them to have left voluntarily. Others added whispers of footsteps, strange sounds below deck, or the sense that someone was still there. These details are powerful, visually powerful, emotionally powerful, and because they are powerful, they spread. A mystery that says, the ship was found abandoned under uncertain circumstances, is unsettling. But a story that says, the food was still warm, and then everyone vanished, becomes unforgettable. This is how myth works. It does not replace facts by force. It replaces them by making them less interesting than drama. And the Mary was almost designed for that process. She was real. Her disappearance was real. The abandoned vessel was real. That gave storytellers a perfect foundation. They did not need to invent the core. They only needed to decorate the silence. Soon the Mary was no longer merely a ship with missing people. She became a cursed vessel, a carrier of bad fate, a ghost ship in the purest sense. Some said the crew had seen something at sea that shattered their minds, something unnatural, something they were never meant to witness. Others claimed the ship herself was the problem, that she had become contaminated by death, that misfortune clung to her timbers, that anyone who crossed her path was touched by the same darkness. Still others imagined far stranger possibilities. Shadows in the fog, sea spirits, an invisible force that could remove people without struggle, without noise, without evidence. Of course, none of these explanations are supported by credible proof. But proof is not what makes a legend endure. Meaning does. People do not always choose the explanation that is most likely. They choose the explanation that best satisfies the emotional shape of the mystery. And the emotional shape of the Mary begged for something supernatural. Because here was a ship that seemed inhabited by absence itself. Not wrecked, not burned, not clearly attacked, only emptied. That kind of emptiness is difficult for the human mind to accept as ordinary. So the mind gives it a soul. That is why ghost ships have always fascinated people. Not because they confirm the paranormal, but because they make absence feel alive. A sunken vessel is a tragedy. An empty vessel is an accusation. It asks, Where did they go? Why is the world still here when they are not? The Mary became more than a maritime mystery. She became a symbol of the sea's unknowable nature, a symbol of the possibility that something can happen in this world and leave behind no final explanation at all. And as the years passed, writers, storytellers, and sensationalists continued to reshape her. Each generation added its own fears. An earlier age feared curses and spirits. A more modern audience might fear hidden crimes, cover-ups, or psychological collapse. But the structure remains the same. We are all trying to answer the same silence. That is why serious researchers have often tried to reclaim the Mary from legend. They return to the logs, the cargo reports, the weather, the ship's condition, and the known facts. They try to remind us that mystery does not always require magic. Sometimes it only requires missing information. But myth is difficult to erase once it has rooted itself, because myth offers something reason often cannot: completion. It gives the unknown a face, a curse, a ghost, a malevolent force, a thing to point at and say, there, that is what happened. Reality is less generous. Reality often says only this: something happened. We know that much. The rest is gone. And for many people, that is harder to live with. So the Mary continued her second life. Not on the sea, but in memory, in books, in whispered retellings, and in the long tradition of stories people tell when the world feels too empty without explanation. Yet even after stripping away the ghosts, what remains is not relief, because the truth may be even colder than the legend. If there was no haunting, then what destroyed the people aboard the Mary may have been something far more familiar: themselves. Take away the curse. Take away the phantom footsteps. Take away every spirit, every sea demon, every supernatural shadow. What remains? A possibility more severe than haunting. Human beings under pressure, making a decision that sealed their own fate. That may be the most terrifying explanation of all, because it means the Mary was not consumed by something impossible. She may have been undone by the ordinary fragility of human judgment. Imagine the scene. Night at sea. The ship rolling under wind and swell. A sound from below deck. A dull pressure thud, perhaps. A barrel shifting. A vapor burst. A wooden groan amplified by fear. Someone smells alcohol. Someone shouts. The crew gathers. The captain investigates. There may be no visible fire. No flames racing through the hull. No explosion yet. But that may be exactly what made it worse. Because visible danger is easier to understand. Invisible danger is the one that drives the imagination wild. The cargo below was not harmless. If ignition came, there might be no time to respond. The captain had his wife aboard, his child aboard, his crew depending on him. He had to choose: stay on the ship and risk that the next sound, the next spark, the next shift below deck would turn the entire vessel into a trap, or leave the ship temporarily and risk the sea itself. This is not a puzzle with a clean answer. From a distance, we often judge decisions by their outcome, but those aboard the Mary did not know the outcome. They only knew the pressure of the moment. And in such moments, human beings do not act like historians. They act like animals gifted with just enough intelligence to fear possibilities they cannot verify. So perhaps the captain ordered the lifeboat lowered. Perhaps essential instruments were gathered. Perhaps everyone climbed down believing they would stay near the vessel. Watch, wait, and return. That is important. Because if they left believing the separation would be temporary, then the decision becomes tragically understandable. Not foolish. Understandable. A plan does not have to be stupid to become fatal. If the lifeboat was tied to the ship, then all it took was one failure. A gust at the wrong angle. A swell with more force than expected. A worn rope that finally gave way. A knot that slipped under strain. And suddenly the main ship and the lifeboat would no longer belong to the same fate. The Mary, larger and more stable, might drift on. The boat, lower and weaker, would vanish into the sea. Can you imagine that moment? The line snaps. The captain turns. The ship begins to pull away. Row harder. Shout. Wave. Fight the water. Watch the only real shelter you had move farther and farther into darkness. That image does not need ghosts. It is already unbearable, because it is the image of realization. The instant when a choice that felt protective reveals itself as catastrophic. And here is the part that makes this explanation so hard to resist. Many of us would likely have done the same. It is comforting to think that from the safety of modern hindsight, we would have been calmer, clearer, wiser. But on that deck, with that cargo, in that century, under those conditions, certainty would have been impossible. And impossible uncertainty is where human beings become most vulnerable. This is what makes the Mary feel so modern despite her age. The details are maritime, but the structure is universal. How often do people make irreversible choices based on incomplete information? In hospitals, in cockpits, in command centers, in markets, in ordinary homes. Not because they are irrational, but because they are forced to decide before the truth is fully visible. The Mary may be one of history's most haunting examples of that condition. Not evil, not madness, not supernatural interference. Only a moment in which the available information was not enough to guarantee the right choice. That is what makes human beings frightening here. Not because they are cruel, but because they are limited. A limited mind can still be experienced, still be loving, still be responsible, and still lead everyone into disaster. There is no comfort in that. A ghost story at least gives us a monster. A practical explanation gives us none. It tells us that the people aboard the Mary may have done everything they believed necessary to survive, and died because survival itself was misjudged. In a sense, then, the Mary is not only a ghost ship story. It is a story about decision under uncertainty, about the terrifying possibility that there are moments in life when no option feels safe, and the one you choose with the best intentions becomes the road to annihilation. If that is what happened, then the Mary's true horror lies not in the sea, but in a single human fact. We do not need to be wicked, to be fatal. All we need is to be forced to choose in darkness. And the ocean, more than almost any environment on Earth, is a perfect place for darkness to win. Because the sea does not merely create danger. It creates something perhaps even worse. It creates conditions in which no one can ever know for certain what the final moment looked like. On land, disappearances leave systems behind. Roads, buildings, neighbors, witnesses, documents, footprints, surveillance in modern times. But the ocean does not preserve a scene. It dissolves one. That is one reason the Mary became such a lasting mystery. Not only because what happened was strange, but because it happened in the one environment that is best at removing endings. Consider the simplest question people ask. If those aboard the lifeboat died at sea, why were no bodies ever found? It sounds like a challenge. In maritime reality, it is hardly unusual at all. The ocean is enormous beyond ordinary intuition. Currents divide, scatter, swallow, redirect. Weather changes the map faster than memory can keep up. A small boat on open water is not merely vulnerable. It is almost mathematically insignificant. Lose sight of it, and it enters a world where retrieval becomes more hope than plan. Bodies, wreckage, supplies, all of it can vanish. Not because the sea is supernatural, but because scale itself becomes a weapon. Then there is drift. By the time the Mary was found, she was no longer in the place where the critical event had likely occurred. That means the discovered position was not the crime scene. It was the afterimage. The point of departure, the point of danger, the point of separation, and the point of discovery may all have been different. This makes investigation profoundly difficult. Imagine trying to solve a case in which the room moves, the walls dissolve, the floor is gone, and the clock has stopped working. That is the ocean. It does not keep evidence where it happened. It drags it somewhere else, or destroys it entirely. The Mary is a classic example of this moving mystery. She gave us the artifact, without giving us the event. The ship survived as an object, but the process that turned her into a ghost ship was already gone. This is why maritime mysteries feel different from land-based ones. A house can keep its secrets for years. A ship can lose hers in hours. And the sea does something else as well. Something psychological. It amplifies fear. Life aboard a ship is enclosed, repetitive, exposed, and unforgiving. Days are narrow. Horizons are endless. Sound behaves strangely. Odors carry significance. A creak is never just a creak when danger may be below deck. A shift in weather is not scenery. It is prognosis. In such conditions, fear spreads quickly. One sailor notices a smell. Another hears a noise. A third reads both as confirmation that something serious is happening. Soon a possibility becomes a conviction. This matters because disaster at sea is often not the result of a single overwhelming event. It is the result of several manageable concerns, colliding inside an environment that makes accurate interpretation difficult. A little water, a little vapor, a little strain in the hull, a little bad weather, a little group tension. None of those alone must become catastrophe. Together, in the middle of the ocean, they can produce exactly the kind of panic or urgent caution that causes irreversible decisions. The Mary may have been lost in precisely this way, not through one spectacular failure, but through an accumulation of pressures that became fatal only when combined. And because the ocean swallowed the sequence, we are left only with the result. This is why the sea has always invited mythology. It is a place where scale defeats certainty. People fear deep water not only because of what may live in it, but because of what cannot be retrieved from it. Facts, bodies, explanations, last moments. The Mary did not sink into the abyss, and yet she carried abyss-like uncertainty back to the surface. That is rare. A drifting ship returned enough evidence to prove the event was real, but not enough to explain it conclusively. That combination is almost perfect for legend. A total loss can be mourned. A partial return can be obsessed over. And obsession is exactly what the Mary earned. Researchers return to her because the case is plausible. Storytellers return to her because it is atmospheric. Audiences return to her because she occupies that rare place, where reason and dread overlap. The ocean is responsible for part of that overlap. It keeps too little, moves too much, erases too efficiently, and in doing so, it creates mysteries that are not merely unsolved, but structurally difficult to solve. That may be the Mary's deepest lesson. Not that the sea contains monsters, but that the sea is itself a kind of machine for producing uncertainty. A place where events can happen faster than they can be understood, and disappear more completely than human minds are built to accept. So when we look at the Mary, we are not only looking at one ship or one crew, we are looking at a larger truth. When human beings enter an environment far greater than themselves, their systems of logic may still work, but not always well enough to save them. The Mary did not answer that truth. She only carried it into history. And perhaps that is why her silence still feels so loud. Because what frightens us is not merely what the sea can take. It is what the sea can take, without ever having to explain itself. Every mystery has a wound at its center. For the Mary, that wound is not simply disappearance. It is interruption. She has no final sentence. Think about how different this story would feel if one last entry had been left in the logbook. Strong fumes below deck, preparing to lower the boat. Fear of explosion. Any one of those lines might have transformed the Mary from ghost ship legend into a tragic but mostly understandable maritime accident. The sorrow would remain. The deaths would remain. But the haunting would weaken. Because once a final sentence exists, a story closes. The Mary never closed. And that may be the deepest source of her power. Human beings crave endings, even painful ones. A complete tragedy can be mourned. An incomplete one lingers. The Mary lingers because she stopped speaking. One moment too soon. No final explanation. No confirmed distress call. No witness testimony from the last critical hour. No recovered note from the boat. No body found clutching a clue. Just silence. At exactly the place where the story most needed words. That is psychologically devastating. Because a finished disaster allows the mind to settle. An unfinished one does not. It leaves people circling the same questions, returning again and again to the same scene, hoping the answer will somehow emerge through repetition. But repetition does not create evidence. It creates obsession. And perhaps that is why the Mary became more memorable than many larger, deadlier maritime disasters. Those tragedies, however terrible, often came with endings. This one did not. It remained suspended. That suspension is what stories of horror understand so well. The most effective terror is rarely the monster fully revealed. It is the suggestion that something happened, something terrible, and then the evidence was cut short. The Mary is that structure made real. You can sense the event. You can infer the movement. You can almost see the crew lowering the boat, the captain making his choice, the vessel drifting apart from the last people who belonged to her. But you cannot hear the final explanation. And because you cannot hear it, your mind keeps generating possibilities. This is why the Mary is not merely a maritime case. She is almost a psychological machine. People who believe in the paranormal see a supernatural removal. People who favor conspiracies see hidden actors and missing truths. People who trust rational reconstruction see evacuation, drift, and fatal separation. And each of those interpretations reveals as much about the interpreter as about the ship. That is what unfinished stories do. They become mirrors. The Mary mirrors fear differently to different people. To some, she reflects the terror of unseen forces. To others, she reflects the terror of human error. To others still, she reflects the harsh truth that the world does not always preserve enough evidence to justify certainty. Perhaps that last fear is the deepest of all, because it means not every mystery exists to be solved. Some may only exist to be endured. The Mary's missing final sentence forces us into that possibility. Maybe the explanation is simple. Maybe it is almost within reach. Maybe the captain knew exactly why he ordered the evacuation. And had he written one more line, history would have accepted it and moved on. But he did not. Or if he did, the sea did not let us keep it. And so the ship remains forever poised, at the edge of explanation. Not wholly dark, not fully lit. That threshold is what makes her terrifying. A totally vanished ship would be easier, in a way. So would a fully documented one. But the Mary is neither. She gives us enough to approach the truth, and not enough to arrive. That is a far crueler design. Because now the imagination never rests. It keeps stepping onto that deck, keeps opening that cabin door, keeps glancing toward the missing lifeboat, keeps listening for the words that never came. And in the end, that may be the real ghost aboard the Mary. Not the captain, not the crew, not some spectral force from the sea, but the sentence that should have existed, and does not. A mystery can survive many things. Conflicting accounts, bad weather, missing bodies. But when it loses its final sentence, it becomes something else. It becomes legend. And legends do not live because they are solved. They live because they refuse to be finished. More than a century has passed, and people still ask the same question. What happened aboard the Mary? In one sense, we may already be close to the answer. The strongest evidence points toward a human decision made under fear. Perhaps driven by fumes, pressure, uncertainty, concern over explosion, concern over flooding, or some combination of these. A temporary evacuation. A separation from the ship. A fatal drift into the sea. If we are willing to accept that history is often less theatrical than legend, that explanation may be enough. But if that is true, why does the Mary still grip the imagination? Why are we still speaking of her? Not as an unfortunate merchant vessel, but as a ghost ship? Because what she left behind was never just a question of mechanics. She left behind a feeling. The feeling that human beings do not always get to understand what is happening to them in time. The feeling that experience, reason, and caution may still fail in environments too large, too hostile, too uncertain to be mastered. The feeling that reality itself, without any help from the supernatural, can produce scenes so strange they feel like mythology. That is perhaps the Mary's true legacy. She reminds us that mystery does not require magic. Sometimes it requires only incomplete evidence, and a world indifferent to human need for closure. She also reveals something painful about the stories we tell. When facts stop, people do not remain silent. They invent. They decorate. They haunt the emptiness with whatever their era fears most. That is why the Mary has had so many lives. A historical case. A cautionary tale. A paranormal legend. A psychological study in fear. A symbol of the sea's refusal to explain itself. Each version says something different, but all of them orbit the same void. 10 people boarded a ship. The ship was later found. The people were not. That is the core. Everything else grows around it. And perhaps what is most heartbreaking is the possibility that the event itself was not grand at all. No battle. No cinematic storm swallowing the hull whole. No final speech. No dramatic heroics. Just one terrible hour, perhaps. One sequence of concern, discussion, urgency, action. One decision that felt correct in the moment. And then a widening distance between the lifeboat and the ship. If that is what happened, then the Mary is not only mysterious. She is tragic in the most human way possible, because she suggests that some losses are not born from madness or evil, but from the unbearable pressure of trying to protect everyone, when certainty does not exist. That is why her story endures. Not simply because we want to know what happened, but because we recognize ourselves inside the shape of it. Who has not made a choice in partial darkness? Who has not acted on fear, caution, or incomplete information? Who has not later discovered that what seemed safest was not safe at all? The scale is different, of course. The ocean makes everything larger, but the structure is familiar. The Mary is a ship, yes, but she is also a metaphor for the unfinished, for the unprovable, for the moments when reality withholds its final explanation and leaves us staring at an intact surface that conceals a vanished life beneath it. That is why she continues to appear in documentaries, books, essays, and midnight narrations, because the world has never stopped being fascinated by stories that promise an answer and then deny it. The Mary promised one. She left behind a ship full of almost answers, a ship whose condition said enough to provoke reason and not enough to satisfy it, a ship that invited every generation to tell the story again in its own language. And perhaps that is the final irony. The people aboard the Mary disappeared, but the ship itself never truly left. It remained. In reports, in rumor, in maritime history, in the architecture of fear, not as a solved case, but as a continuing echo. So when people call her a ghost ship, perhaps they do not mean that ghosts walk her decks. Perhaps they mean something else. Perhaps they mean that the ship carries the ghost of an unanswered question. A question about danger, about judgment, about the sea, about how little of the world we truly control. And maybe those are the real cargoes the Mary carried. Not only industrial alcohol, not only her captain, his family, and his crew, but three far older burdens. The fear of choosing wrong, the pain of never knowing for certain, and the silence that remains when the world refuses to give us a final word. That is why the Mary still matters, because long after the ship herself vanished from the sea, the shape of her mystery remained afloat. A vessel was found. The people were gone. And more than a century later, we are still standing on that deck in our minds, listening to the wind, staring into the empty distance, waiting for an explanation that may never come. And that, more than any curse, more than any phantom, more than any tale of spirits on the water, is the longest echo the Mary left behind. So in the end, what really happened to the Mary? Maybe the answer is not supernatural at all. Maybe there were no ghosts on board, no curse, no sea monster waiting in the dark. Maybe what happened was something far more human and far more tragic. A strange smell below deck, a sudden sound from the cargo hold, fear of an explosion, fear that the ship might not survive the next moment. And then, one decision, a decision made under pressure, a decision made in uncertainty, a decision that may have felt completely right at the time. Leave the ship, just for a while. Move into the lifeboat. Wait at a safe distance. Return when the danger has passed. But the sea does not forgive temporary mistakes. A rope snaps. The wind shifts. The current pulls. And suddenly the ship that was meant to be left behind for only a few moments is gone forever into the distance. If that is what happened, then the most terrifying part of this story is not that the Mary was haunted. It is that the people on board may have done exactly what they believed would save their lives, and still disappeared. That is why this case has never truly died. Because the Mary is more than a ghost ship. She is a reminder that the sea keeps its secrets, that human judgment has limits, and that sometimes the world does not give us a final answer. A ship was found. The people were gone. And more than a century later, we are still staring at that empty deck, asking the same question. What happened here? Maybe we will never know. And maybe that is the real reason the Mary still haunts us. Not because something impossible happened, but because something real did. Something silent. Something final. Something the ocean never gave back.